Thank you.
Thank you so much for the introduction. And I put all that again into this slide just because I would assume that Gala will send out the slide deck afterwards, so you have that as a reference, and you have that QR code, and then you can find me on LinkedIn if you want to connect. I won't go over that. Thank you, James, for handling the introduction. So I will be talking about data in marketing localization, and I've actually heard quite a few presentations today where people already talked about data for language quality. Just the last talk here in this room was about that. Obviously, the landscape has changed quite a bit in terms of the role that data are playing everywhere. That's not something new. I remember that I started in the localization industry, as James mentioned, over 25 years ago. We didn't even know how many people would use a language in a certain market because we could see the sales data, but they would have made, for one product I remember particularly, we had these great sales in the Netherlands, but it was a few big oil companies that were just distributing them products internationally, so that didn't mean that everybody was using Dutch suddenly for that product. Talking about data in marketing localization. So the very first question that you have to ask, and not only for marketing pages, but for a lot of your web assets, is actually what do you want your visitors to do, right? For pre-sales pages particularly, there are a few options. You might want to have people buy a product directly. You might want them to contact a sales team in many different ways. You can have a chat, you can have obviously phone numbers, forms, and so on. There are products where you want people to sign in, so your pre-sales pages might double up with that function. You might want them to download a specific app or link them at least to the famous stores, like the Google Play Store, App Store for Apple, and so on. But you might also just want people to inform about your products and basically make them more qualified. So for that whole question, there's this beautiful model of the marketing funnel. I don't know how many of you are familiar with that. Those of you who work in marketing, for those of you who are in marketing, that's not something new. But I worked in software localization for a long time, and when I saw that funnel, I was like, wow, that makes it really, really understandable. So basically, you have these different steps in the process from awareness to conversion, and you always lose a few people in that funnel, right? There's always a little less people. So not everybody who goes to your page will buy your product if that's what you're doing, what you're trying to make people do on that page. And so obviously the funnel is smaller on the bottom than it's on the top, where you try to pick up a lot of potential candidates for buying. And so for these different stages, from awareness, interest, consideration to conversion, there's quite a few data that you might want to consider. And that's where we'll get started with a few more details. And so one of the very easy things in tracking the success of your web pages is obviously how many visitors do you have. And you want to look at the visitors all up, but you also want to look at how did these visitors actually come to you. So there's a different few channels. There's people who search for your product. They might find you on a results page of a big search engine, such as Google or Baidu in China. And so that's organic traffic. You also have the owned and operated, so your pages, people will get linked within your ecosystem. You can have media campaigns, you can have like social media, you can also have other forms. I showed you that QR code, right? You can even have that as a print advertising. Somebody scans the QR code and gets in. During the Super Bowl here in the US, there was a commercial where they just showed a QR code on the screen to get people to visit their website, and so on. So I will talk a little bit more about different pivots, but already saying here, Stefan and Stephanie, who talked a few hours back, were already pointing out there you will often have visitors that you might not really want to have on those specific pages that come from a different market that end up on the wrong page because of browser settings, or they feel that when they're from an English-speaking country, they might feel that maybe the US page is the most reliable one, but if you have a whole set of different locales that you're offering, you want to send your customers to the right one so that they end up seeing the right prices in the right currency, and they also get into the right lower conversion funnel. So looking at visitors, you already need to get more granular there, right? Basically per market. So I'm pointing that out to the right there, the dimension. And as with so many data, just a snapshot in time doesn't really help you a whole lot. So you want to see the trends. I can tell you, without giving too much away, that, for example, at Microsoft, at the beginning of the pandemic with lockdowns, we saw very different visitor trends than we had seen before. Suddenly everybody needed to be online, mostly online. So obviously like a page for Microsoft Teams saw a huge increase in visitors. But then as things got more normal, we also saw a decline in visitors. So you always need to have that context. And we'll be talking about that again as well a little later. For measuring awareness, you also want to see kind of how do you compare to other pages. So if, and I'm not an expert in SEO, and there's some really, really competent individuals and companies out there that know a lot more about SEO optimization. But as you optimize for SEO, you might want to check how well it has happened. So if somebody looks, I was just mentioning Microsoft Teams because I'm also working on those pages. If somebody looks for conference software, where does Microsoft Teams show up? Where does Zoom show up? And so on. So how do you look like in terms of rankings on the results listings? And so people often look at how many results for the different searches that people can take actually end up on the first page of the results. So that is the first step. You just want to get as many visitors, but obviously just having visitors on the page doesn't really do a whole lot, right? How do you take the next step? How do you get them to being really interested in whatever you're offering them on those pages, to even considering to convert? So there's a few really great measures that you can take. So one is the bounce rate, which basically is the number of people that leave your page without taking any action. And since you also will have people who read the content on your page, even in today's age, there's still people who really consume the content, you want to put a time threshold on that. So if they spend a certain amount of time, you know that they actually really were looking at the information there. But if they leave the page without clicking anywhere, that would be considered a bounce. So obviously, the engagement rate, that's the opposite. You basically take out the bounce rate from all visitors. And that really tells you how engaging a page is. Is that something that, are those pages something that appeal to people? And that's already one area where you can really look at the success of your transcreation work, for example. Because if you see a source page that is doing really well in terms of engagement, and you see a page for one locale that is doing really badly, there might be something that is absolutely not appealing about that content. It might be also the visual assets, but maybe there's something wrong with translations and people just leave because they don't feel they can get anything out of it. So for example, if you have machine translation on that page, people read a sentence, feel like, okay, this will not really tell me things in a good way, they drop off. So, and there's also the marketable visitors rate, where you also take out people, for example, if you give people the option to sign in on your page into a web service, for example, you might want to take that out as well, because those people clearly didn't come to be marketed to. So, to get a little more granular, you don't only want to know these percentages, but you also want to know the individual page elements that people engage with, right? And so there's some really great tools out there. I won't advertise any tools, but some of you might even recognize what this is from. But the question, how do people behave on the page? So you see a very granular analysis of one of our Microsoft 365 pages here. You can look at lots of different dimensions. I'm just showing a few of those dimensions here. Obviously, we're often interested in how many people, percentage-wise, click on a particular page element, and that can inform your strategy of adding content by market quite a bit. So when you look at a menu, for example, and you feel like, oh, there's something missing that we should have for one specific market. Maybe there's a particular help topic. We see that people just need to understand better how to use a product in one market. You add that to a menu. Well, if that menu itself doesn't really get a whole high click rate, right? Any entry in that menu would not really matter that much. So you would already make the decision of maybe just adding it somewhere else on the page. And you can actually see, like for every link that you add to the pages, if there's specific links, you could track very granularly how attractive that new link is. Obviously, it also informs kind of what you're investigating, what is attractive across markets, where are differences between markets, where do you want to adjust. So number of clicks in absolute numbers, the time before first click, like how long do people hesitate? Do people click something repeatedly? Click recurrence is a really interesting one. There's something called rage clicking. People who feel that something doesn't work. Actually, in this example, there are actually a few elements that you cannot click. So people click on things that they don't get anywhere. There's no link behind those. So those are obviously also spaces where you might want to improve. And then there's other engagement data like hover rate, how many people are actually over a certain page element, how exposed are page elements. So again, for those of you already in marketing, you're all familiar with the term below the fold. There is this cutoff. So this page is actually, it's going, find a route through here, getting cut off. So everything that's below the screen in a certain screen resolution, so you very often go with a standard screen resolution. Everything that's below that has a lower exposure rate. People won't see it as often. People will first see everything that's on the page as they see it on the screen. Not everybody is scrolling down, and the further down you go on the page, the lower the exposure rate. So another thing to consider when you want to add page elements, where do you add them? Well, everybody wants to add stuff on top of the page, but then you don't want to clutter those things either. So talking about user behavior, I showed kind of the analytics that you can have on a particular page, but a website is not only the sum of its pages, but also kind of the connection between those pages, right? I mentioned the owned and operated, where you link pages. So they're kind of natural flow. Sometimes you might send visitors directly into a conversion funnel. You try to get them to buy right on the page that they get to from a search engine. That is probably not always and not that often the case. You might have a set of pages that are part of that customer journey. And so you want to understand that as well. And so you need to have those analytics as well. And there are tools where you can track how many people are going from a given page to other pages, and kind of the inverse of that, how many people on a given page are coming from different pages, so that you really understand what is the typical customer journey and how do you want to optimize that. How do you want to make sure that people get the right information within those different steps? So there's non-preferred flows where people just click and they randomly end up on a page that you actually want them to end up on in the first place. So you will have non-preferred and you will have preferred flows within your page flows. So for the whole behavior on the page, for the user behavior, and I didn't really put a whole lot of content in here because there's so many different things that you can ask your customers to learn more about how they think about your page. User surveys are a great tool, but they're also a very dangerous tool. As probably all of us have experienced, you can get that survey fatigue, right? You go to a random web page and they ask you, like, how did you like this? How many of us are actually answering those questions? And especially when it says, like, can we ask you for 5 minutes of your time? So you have to be careful with those user surveys. On the other hand, they can be really, really powerful. We, in my team, we do a quarterly survey with our users where we try to figure out the translation quality. We don't ask for translation quality because people see things in one language. They don't see the source language. So we ask about language, and of how appealing the language is and so on. And we often ask one more question where we go through different things. So you can get a lot out of that. We actually get enough users. For localization, when you're in marketing localization, you often get answers that are not related to the language quality and that are often not related necessarily to the direct page, but they're related to the products. So you also need to filter out the noise there. And obviously, when you do a survey on a multilingual page, you need to be able, if you give people the chance to enter text freely, you obviously need to have kind of that inverse process. Do you machine translate the feedback? Do you have experts in the different languages that can tell you what people said? Because you don't want to have all that, that feedback in different languages and you cannot consume it properly. And then I put in here, like you have evergreen surveys, you can run the same survey in a regular cadence and have it on all the time, or you have just a survey for a certain period of time. So something where you might not get a whole lot of quantitative data, but where you get really valuable qualitative data around web pages is user studies / interviews. And the difference, sometimes there can be, it can be blurred. There's a few companies out there that offer basically self-moderated user tests where you give people a script, you tell them, go to this page, what do you think of these things, what do you think of these things? So you offer them a few questions and they say, then go to the next page by clicking this link and so on. So you can send them through one of your flows, one of your preferred flows, or you just keep them on one particular page and have them answer a set of questions. And they do that at home, they record the session, and you have quite a bit of manual work, right? You have to go through that. These tools are getting better. There's now tools that try to put a sentiment analysis on it, but it's also right now mostly restricted to English. There's not that many tools that would do that in another language. We basically, as people comment on a page, you can figure out if they like something or not, even without a particular question. So yeah, these self-recorded user tests can be pretty telling in terms of qualitative data. You can also have kind of a mix between an interview and somebody going through a flow remotely by just having them screen share, so you can observe them then like that. And kind of the traditional form always used to be bringing people into a lab environment, and that is obviously a very costly thing. But like if you have the money, if you have the budget for that, you can go in things like tracking, people doing eye tracking, where are people actually gazing on a page, all those things. You can get super granular. In terms of user interviews, so you can either bring in a group of people. I mean, the environment today, it's with all the changes, to remote work and hybrid work. It's a lot more acceptable now that you don't have to be in one room with the people. So you can set up a conference call, but obviously you can also still do it in the traditional environment, just bringing people into a room and ask questions. And that's an art in itself, because you don't want to ask biased questions and prime people. Yeah, and you can do that with an individual, or you can do that with a whole group of users. And as I said, these data, if you have a group of 5 users that you ask a particular question and go through a certain flow, that's not statistically significant. Even if they all tell you that they hate your web page, you should verify that in a different way. But the qualitative insights can be super useful, because you don't do these studies to see the numbers. You try to understand the reasons why. So if they tell you they all hate the page, hopefully you have a follow-up question for that. Okay, if you hate our page, why do you do that? And kind of dig deeper into that. So as we've gone through the funnel, from the awareness and then consideration and interest, the final step should be conversion. And as I said, there's lots of things that we might want users to do on the page, right? Purchase is a typical thing, or sign up for a freemium product. You can also ask people to sign up for a trial version that then expires. Download, sign in, I mentioned those. You might just want to add people to an email list. Subscribe to a newsletter, and then all these different ways of contacting your sales team. And obviously, for all those, you need to have the available channels. So for a lot of these things, you would also have a sort of lower funnel. So for example, the purchase, that is the last step for your web page. But then you need to have something where people have a checkout experience, right? And within that checkout experience, you might lose people again. You might have that funnel that starts with everybody getting into the purchase funnel, but as soon as you ask them for a payment instrument, so as soon as you ask them to provide a credit card, you might lose all the users in Brazil that actually prefer the boleto bancario, or you might lose all the Chinese customers that say, what credit card? I want to use my Alipay. So especially payment instruments can be a big thing that impacts your lower purchase funnel. Or for trial sign up, if you offer a trial, but people have to provide a payment instrument, or they have to provide their email address, or more contact information, they might drop out at one of those steps. So for tracking those data, you would need to basically show another funnel where you see the different steps. It might be the different customer steps within that experience, and track where do you lose people. All that said, so the conversion, you basically want to express that in relative numbers. So regardless of what you want to do, whether you want to get people to sign in, and you see basically between buy intents and purchases, or sign intents and actual sign-ins, that is basically what I just referred to as the lower funnel. Those things, you might still lose people there. So you look at those percentage numbers. Oops. You see to the right here as abstract, as variables. So you always want to express that and see, okay, how many people do I lose there? Obviously, after the conversion is not the end of the story. So you got somebody to purchase, or you got somebody to contact your sales team. There's lots of other steps, like especially for sales. I won't go into details there. But for purchase, you also want to track how many customers do you actually retain over a period of time. How many people actually drop off? So if you have like a monthly subscription, how many people make it through the first year, or even just the first 6 months? So if you have if you have a yearly subscription, you want to see kind of how many people renew after that. And then there might be also upgrade opportunities, so especially for the freemium, right? You want to track how many people actually move from your freemium version to the paid version, so those conversions, or when somebody started a trial, how many of those people actually go to the paid product. So that is one big area where you really want to track kind of how do people stick with your product or how do they upgrade. And related to that is obviously two other dimensions, namely usage, because if people don't use your product, they will probably not renew a subscription or buy it again, and customer satisfaction, which also often goes hand in hand with the usage. If people are not satisfied, they will probably also use it less. So I already talked about that a little bit. For all these data in marketing and localization, marketing teams and localization teams have often a very different understanding. Marketing teams think about markets mostly as geographic entities. They might understand that there's some territories that they're selling to that might not be countries, but overall they probably mostly think about nation states. They also often think about their source market and then ROW, rest of the world. And localization teams will think in locales. The way that you're really presenting your assets to your users is on a language or language plus market on a locale specific page. And so sometimes it's even that first step of communication where you really have to tell people, okay, this one language page, often it is actually the EN/US page, also serves all these other countries because we don't have a specific page for them. And that was mentioned in a talk earlier today as well. I think it was Stephanie and Stefan who talked about countries like Belgium, Switzerland, Canada, where you have more than one language, right? So it's not like you're not done with Canada when you only have an English Canada version. You will also need the French version, and so on. So making sure that you don't have any disconnects there. And then also understanding kind of how do markets group together. The very simplest of divisions is emerging versus developed markets. I think that's a little too ungranular, but that's still something that people often look at. But you might want to group other countries. We heard about GDPR, for example. So a lot of the EU countries that fall under the same legislative framework, but then Brazil has similar legislation now. So you want to group those just in terms of cookie compliance, right? So basically making sure that you really understand what data you want to pivot to. So now you have this plethora of data. You have all these things from page engagement to understanding kind of how many people really converted their trial into a paid version. What do you do with that? So you obviously need to have some key metrics in your marketing localization team. So what are the really important key performance indicators? What shows you that you've been successful with your team in doing that localization work? What are the patterns? Are there specific trends? And kind of hand in hand with that, if you have a trend, you can also spot an anomaly. Where are things very different? And that can be within one market, where you just see suddenly there's a big drop in China in February. And well, for understanding that, you might just remember that there's a big holiday in China in February. So trying to understand those anomalies and explain them. Also understanding that some of the anomalies where things look too good might actually be bad news. So we've seen that really high sales numbers might indicate fraud. People might just give you false credit cards and buy your product. So not all good news or not all good-looking data are really good news. And then, as I said, like you need to keep the big picture in mind. There's underlying macroeconomic trends, especially the last 2 years. We saw a big overlay of that just with the pandemic. Seasonality, not all markets follow the same seasonality. Back to school might be in different times of the year for different markets. And then holidays, especially when it's week-long holidays, but you will see a Thanksgiving and a Christmas drop in the United States, which you won't see in the Middle East, for example, but then you will see other drops in those markets. So kind of in terms of practical tips, and I know that I still want to leave a little bit of time for Q&A, you need to look at tracking those metrics, understand the storytelling with data just the same way that Andrew, who spoke before, was talking about linguistic data. Think about what data or dimensions for data you're missing, and that very often is that language-specific angle or that locale-specific angle. Marketing teams might look just at numbers overall or mix rest of world altogether, right? You want to have that angle. Obviously, don't try to make data look better than they actually are, and have a regular cadence to discuss those data. I have a beautiful data visualization. This is from the 1860s, showing Napoleon's march to Moscow. So on the right, you see Moscow up there. And it's just visualizing the size of his army. So they came back very diminished, right? Very clear image of what happened. You don't need to look at the numbers for each of the stations. You immediately get what happened with that endeavor. And then, obviously, all these data analysis don't mean anything when you don't take action. So you need to understand where you can make changes, because for a localization team, there might be only certain areas. I talked about possibly making a change in the navigation and a header. Headlines, CTA, so the call to action that you have on a page. Images might be really good assets to switch out. And then any sort of copy, graphic, links within the main body of your page can be changed. But there might also be things that you just cannot touch, because you would touch the overall global strategy, right? How flexible are you in changing a flow? Where there's a lot of thinking behind from a business team. So if you have the chance, maybe you can test hypotheses. Maybe you can look at, okay, we have a market where we don't convert in a certain area that well. Can we do a test where we just change some of our copy? So that's obviously the most powerful tool that you have, really testing things before implementing. Sometimes you can also go, and if it's a not that risky change, we say, okay, for these markets, we go with, for example, a different header, and then we track what the impact was. So that's another method there. Well, and I didn't even talk about all the other data, like some of the foundational data for web pages. How fast does a page load? All those things that can be pretty important too. And sometimes for web teams, they should not neglect if a local page just doesn't load quickly enough. Maybe that's the reason why you have lower conversion rates somewhere, right? And then I also didn't talk about all the localization health data, kind of the language quality ratings, all that user feedback, and so on. So with that, we unfortunately only have 5 minutes of time left, but I hope that there are some questions.
Thank you. I have a question about, I guess, the close collaboration between localization and marketing. You touched upon it a little bit, but most of the data points that, you talked about and we can look at are not only tied to localization, right? It could be many, many different factors that are affecting these, these data points. So, how do you deal with that? Because it's not just localization driving those specific numbers. It's really just a set of different things. Is it just close collaboration with marketing and product, or are there any specific things that as a localization only independently you can actually affect and do and change?
Quite frankly, I wish we could isolate, like this is the exact localization impact, and those things are happening through, let's say, a macroeconomic impact. Like, and sometimes we have a little bit of a proxy for that, like for English, we don't localize. We see different behavior for post-Brexit UK versus Australia, for example, and the US. We also have different macroeconomic factors, but we don't have the language differences. So sometimes we see a little bit of that, but in general, it's not really easy to say this is the change that we've made by localization that really impacted things overall. But what we can do is, and especially when we're doing testing, we can still measure kind of post-factum. So instead of expecting that maybe a single translation might make an impact, it's really more tracking kind of the overall smaller changes, how do they add up, and kind of seeing that sum. But yes, it requires a lot of close collaboration with marketing, with the main marketing team. But ultimately, we want all markets to do well, and how much really is our contribution and how much is their contribution for the overall design. We cannot exactly figure that out. Maybe that's not the worst problem to have if the numbers overall are good. That's a really good question.
Yeah, thanks, sir. And I have something, I suppose it goes in a similar direction, which is sort of when you have a translated version of a specific landing page, how do you ensure that it's not the market, or how do you ensure that whether or not it's the market that is maybe not responding to it, or whether it's sort of the translation is not qualitative enough? That's to say, so how do you make this distinction? That's to say, I create a French page, how do I ensure that the quality is good, and it's definitely not the translation's fault, it's the market that is just not interested in that offer, and how do you sort of factor those two things against each other?
So ultimately, I have to say that probably disappointing for everybody who's on the translation side, but for us, we see that as one package. So we see it as if a certain market really does not like our content, and we see a lot less engagement, for example, there's something wrong, and it might be happening on different levels. It might be hard to figure out whether it's really a particular translation, but it can be just the overall tone, but it could also be the visual assets, it could be just the overall design, and so that's when we need to experiment with different pieces. We don't really experiment with translation quality. We basically have that one standard, and we see that as basically more as a foundational thing where it's really, we've never tried out just doing machine translation. We don't want to endanger our business. Obviously, maybe you could try that in a user testing environment, right, where you give people that option and say, hey, is that good enough? Where we really see translation quality and overall design of a page more as something that goes together, and see that as, kind of what does the overall market version of a page do for our customers in a given market.
Thank you.
Thank you. I'll take another one since nobody else has one. Just, looking at all this data that you told us about is great, but I think in some cases, especially maybe companies where the localization function is much smaller, just having access to these numbers may be a challenge. So any tips for, smaller functions that would like to have access to this data, but they don't know where to start? Do they go to marketing? Do they go to data? If the data's not sliced the right way, sometimes it's not, visualized by locale, like you were saying. Any Any tips you can give?
Quite frankly, that's always part of, and I feel like it's always part of any localization function to educate your stakeholders and basically telling people that it will be useful for them. I mean, it's fairly easy at Microsoft. We know that many percent come from the US market, and we have a lot of other markets that contribute to our revenue. So we need to keep an eye on them, and if we are not granular with that, if you just have one rest of world bucket. But so I would say the first step is really trying to explain to people what is the main dimension, and it would be basically the locale dimension that you want to see data by. And most of those data are available. They need to be made available to the localization teams. But I would start really with making the case for why you need that, because then you can fine-tune your localization work. I think sometimes really marketing teams just don't think about that. They don't think about the aspect that, oh yeah, it gives you a lot more different levers that you can pull and push.
All right, thank you so much. Thank you, Soren. Really appreciate it. All right, let's wrap it up.